Welcome back to Let's Make a Game, a channel about making computer role-playing games using the free program Twine and the Sugarcube format for Twine. In this video, I would like to continue talking about my current project of coding the combat system for a viewer's game. In particular, I'd like to talk about enemy movement and more specifically about coding a limit to how many enemies can be in the same place at the same time. The viewer whose game this is going to be wants a maximum of 3 hovering enemies and a maximum of 3 non-hovering enemies in a given range band at a given time. So we had set it up so that they begin obeying this limit, but we hadn't yet coded their movement so that if they want to move in a way that would break those limits, that will be noticed by the program and stopped. But as you can see, I have set up a combat here. There's 14 enemies, so there's 3 enemies in most of the range bands and 2 in one of them, because there are a total of 5 range bands which the enemies initially appear, or where the enemies initially appear. But let's have a look at this. Enemy 2 chooses the attack swipe. There's no one in range, and so they move. Well, that makes sense because enemy 2 is up here, and swipe has a range of only 1 range band, so there's no player character or companion to hit there. And so they want to move. They want to move away from the fight, but it says that range band is full, so the enemy stays still. And then they choose the same attack. They want to move again, and this time it says that they want to move towards the fight. And again, it says that that range band is full, so the enemy stays still. And that makes sense because if you look at the range bands that are 1 forward, which is down on our screen because the companion and player character are down the bottom, 1 forward and 1 back, they both have 3 hovering enemies in them, and so that is the maximum. And so enemy 2 can't move forward and can't move back, and so they will just waste their action if they end up choosing to move. So it seems to be doing what it should be doing. Let's have a look at the code that allows this to happen. So last video we talked about these 2 new, just zoom in, we talked about these 2 new arrays, enemy underscore hovering and enemy underscore ground, and they keep track of how many enemies, how many hovering enemies and how many enemies on the ground respectively are in a given range band. So if enemy underscore hovering 3 is equal to 2, that means there are 2 hovering enemies in range band 3. That is 3 spaces away from the player character, because distance is always measured with the player character's position being 0. And enemy underscore ground works exactly the same, except it keeps track of the non-hovering enemies, which are just the pupae. The adult males and adult females are flying until they... Well, sorry. The adult males and adult females are flying enemies until they're wounded, and then they become ground enemies. And then the pupae can't fly at all, so they start as ground enemies. And we set up the enemies in such a way that it sets up the initial values. And we're going to use those 2 arrays when we get an enemy to move, or when an enemy looks at wanting to move. But we also need to update the enemies when an enemy dies, because we don't want to count dead enemies. So there are 2 places where an enemy can die. Usually it'll be the result of the player character side successfully attacking them and reducing their hit points below 1. But technically it could happen when the enemies attack as well. because they could get a critical failure and lose 1 hit point and be on beyond 1 hit point, and therefore die. Now that's pretty corner case, pretty unlikely, but because it can happen, we do need to have code that deals with it. So let's look at those two first, and then we'll look at the movement. So when the PC side attacks, because I've gone through this code already, I won't go through it in detail. But what we want is the part where an enemy is successfully hit and takes damage. And that is down here, and specifically we want the bit that's to do with if, so this is the bit where they take, they lose damage. Enemy something 2 is always hit points. And we look at that hit points and we say, is it less than 1? And if so, we say enemy Z is dead. That's all existing stuff. This is the new bit of code we have here. We look at enemy Z4, and that will be either the letter capital Y or the letter capital N. It'll be a Y if they're hovering and an N if they're not. And if they are hovering, we reduce 1 slot of the enemy hovering array by 1, because there's 1 less hovering enemy in a particular location. And if they're not hovering, we reduce the enemy underscore ground array by in a particular slot by 1, because there's 1 fewer ground enemy. So how do we find out which slot? Well, in both cases, we use enemy Z3, because enemy Z3 is their location. So if they are a hovering enemy and they're in location 2, let's say, then enemy underscore hovering 2 will be reduced by 1. And let's say if they are in location 1 and they are a non-hovering enemy, then enemy underscore ground slot 1 will be reduced by 1. That's the usual way that enemies will die, but as I said, they can also die as the result of a critical failure, or what this game calls a long failure. And that happens down here. They lose 1 hit point, and if it is reduced to 0, we give the message that that enemy is dead. And we have exactly the same code, except that instead of Z, we're using $ini underscore who. ini underscore who is a variable that keeps track of which character is acting. If we're on the enemy strikes page, it is an enemy that is acting in particular. And so we look at we do the same thing. We look at their slot 4 of their part of the enemy array. Are they a hovering enemy? Well, we're going to reduce the enemy underscore hovering array's slot that corresponds to their location by 1. And if this is not the case, then they must be a non-hovering enemy. And so we do exactly the same, except for the enemy underscore ground array. Now, we could have had enemy hovering and enemy ground as the same array and just distinguish it by, like perhaps we could have had this be a number, and then like have this as a 2-dimensional array, and one of the dimensions is whether they're hovering or ground. But we set this one up as a text file for a good reason, because it made it easier in a particular place where we were printing it. So we might as well keep it as it is. But we could have done it the other way, and this code would have been slightly shorter, because we wouldn't have had to have this if-else. Anyway, that is result of damage, but let's look at movement. So this is, now we used to have 2 movement passages. We had enemy moves and enemy moves II, or 2. But the new way that we're doing it makes it simpler. Specifically, we don't need to choose a target to move towards or away from because all of the player characters and their companions are in one space. So moving towards the fight is always moving in one direction, and moving away from the fight is always moving in another direction. So we don't really need to do that. So here is the simpler version of movement, which also has the possibility that they can't move because of crowding, essentially. So as you remember, whether they want to move forward or back towards the fight or away from it is based on a random roll, which is compared to their hit points. If the roll is smaller than or equal to their hit points, they want to move towards the fight, and if the roll is higher, they want to move away from the fight, and that means that enemies with lower hit points will tend to want to run away, which means that if an enemy is seriously wounded, it'll probably want to flee, which, is realistic. So we set X equal to either 1 or -1, meaning that they want to move away from or towards the fight, because if they want to move away from the fight, because remember the player character is at 0, so they are going to be at 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, and so adding 1 to that range band is moving away from the player character. And conversely, taking 1 from that range band, that location, is moving towards the fight. That's why -1 is towards and 1 is away. So here's what we do. That's all basically old code. I did change the message. It says they want to move away from the fight or toward the fight. It used to say away from or toward either the player character or companion 1 or companion 2 because they picked a specific target, but that isn't really necessary now. So we look at their location, which is enemy INI_who 3. Once again, INI_who standing for who has initiative, essentially, and enemy, of course, being a shorter way of writing enemy. This is the location of a given enemy. And so where they want to go is just their current location plus X, which is either +1 or +-1, i.e. -1, and we put that in the temporary variable Z. Then we look at the array relevant to this enemy's type. So we look at enemy INI_who 4, which is whether they're hovering or not hovering, and if it equals yes, we look at the Zth slot of the enemy hovering array, and if they're not hovering, we look at slot Z of the enemy ground array, enemy_ground array. So in other words, we look at how many, this is going to tell us how many enemies of that type are in the range band that the enemy wants to move into. And if that number equals stack, and remember stack is the stacking limit, it's the maximum number of enemies of a particular type that can be in the one range band at the one time. So if that value that we've got here or here, if that already equals the stacking limit, then we say, well, that range band is full, and so the enemy stays still. They can't move because they want to move into a place that is already as full as we've decided it can be. Otherwise, we move, and moving involves changing the location, which is we set enemy INI_who 3 to be equal to Z, remembering that Z is where they want to move. And we also, before we do that, we change either enemy ground or enemy hovering, depending on whether they're a hovering or a ground enemy. We reduce, let's say they're hovering. We look at their location and we reduce the number of hovering enemies in that location by 1, and we increase the number of hovering enemies in the location they go to by 1. But of course, which makes sense if they move from range band 2 to range band 3, well, there should be 1 fewer of that type of enemy in range band 2 and one more in range band 3. If they're not hovering, we do exactly the same, but it's for enemy_ground. And we do this before we move them because we need to get that old value of their location. We're reducing the number in their old location and increasing it in their new location. And so therefore we can't change their location to be equal to that new location until we've done that. Otherwise we'd get the wrong value here. And then of course we go on to the next action. And so that means that the totals of how many of each type are in each range band are kept continually updating. Unless I've made a mistake somewhere, they'll always be accurate. Except that there is one way in which they can become inaccurate now, and that is when the player character and their companions wound a hovering enemy, that enemy becomes non-hovering. They sort of fall to earth, perhaps because they want to kind of get into the fight, or their wings are wounded, or whatever. They can't maintain buoyancy with a wound. I don't know that the fiction has yet explained this, but that's what happens. And we need to deal with that. Firstly, we would need to reduce the number of hovering enemies in that range band by 1, and we'd need to increase. So we'll need to reduce 1 slot of enemy hovering, and we'll need to increase the same slot of enemy ground. But also, if that now means there are too many ground enemies, we'll need to make them move somewhere else so that we don't break that rule. But that's what we're going to be doing next time. For now, I hope that was useful or interesting to at least some of you, and I hope you will tune in next time.